Life has a way of taking you by surprise, and occasionally the people you trust the most turn out to be the ones that complicate matters. Tom is my name. I'm 36 years old and reside in a tiny, peaceful town outside of Manchester. Despite its relative simplicity, my life had always been fulfilling. My days as a project manager for a computer company were devoted to managing budgets, team deadlines, and customer demands. I enjoyed it despite how busy it was. I liked how my employment was structured. James and my closest buddies dominated my social life while I wasn't working. Since college, James had been my best friend. Unending football games, bad dating advice, crazy evenings out, and the kind of relationship that felt more like family were all things we had experienced together. Sarah, James's wife, joined that inner circle if James was a brother. After 8 years of marriage, James and Sarah had been together for almost 10 years. Their wedding seems like it was yesterday to me. It was a stable marriage with the kind of love and laughter that everyone aspired to find, as if it were carved out of pure gold. Sarah was beautiful, inside and out. She was intelligent, charismatic, and always had this aura of warmth that made everyone feel comfortable. If you asked any of our friends, they'd tell you Sarah was the kind of person who would light up a room without even trying. We always got along, and I admired her for the kind of person she was. For a long time, Sarah and I were just that. Good friends. She was James's wife, after all, and I had immense respect for their relationship. But things had begun to change over the past few months. James had been working overseas on a major project in Dubai. He had taken the job opportunity to boost his career and provide for their future. But the long-distance separation began taking its toll on Sarah, and over time it became more apparent. Sarah and I kept in touch while James was away. Sometimes she'd call to ask if I could help with something around the house or check on their dog when she was at work late. Occasionally, we'd grab coffee or dinner and talk about how she was doing, how James was handling the move, and how hard it was for them both. Sarah seemed fine for the most part, but I knew there was something simmering beneath the surface. One evening, after a long day at the office, I got a text from Sarah. "Hey, Tom, I know it's short notice, but is it okay if I come over tonight? My water heater's broken and the place is freezing." I glanced at the message, my fingers already typing a quick response. "Of course, no problem. You're always welcome here." Sarah showed up an hour later, carrying an overnight bag and looking tired but relieved. The weather had been miserable, cold and rainy, which only added to her exhaustion. I greeted her at the door, offering her a towel to dry off and ushering her inside. "Thanks, Tom. I really appreciate this. My place is like an icebox, and I didn't want to freeze all night," she said, shaking off the rain. "No worries, Sarah. You know you can always crash here if you need to," I replied with a smile, taking her coat and hanging it up. She settled into the guest room while I prepared some tea in the kitchen. We hadn't seen each other in person for a while, so we ended up sitting on the couch, sipping tea and catching up. What I didn't realize then was how this evening would turn out to be unlike any other. Our conversation started off as it always did, light, friendly, and full of jokes. But after a while, the tone shifted. Sarah seemed more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. She talked about how difficult it had been adjusting to James being away. She missed him terribly, but more than that, she felt like they were growing apart. "It's hard, you know. We barely talk anymore," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "When we do, it's all about work or practical things. We used to have so much fun together, but now it feels like we're just going through the motions." I nodded, not sure what to say. I hadn't realized things were that bad between them. "That sounds rough, Sarah. I know James loves you, though. He's probably just caught up in his work. It's tough with him being so far away." "I know," she said, a tear slipping down her cheek. "But sometimes it feels like I don't even exist in his world anymore. He's in Dubai, living this whole other life, and I'm stuck here, trying to hold everything together." Without thinking, I reached out and took her hand, trying to comfort her. "You're not alone, Sarah. You've got people who care about you. I'm here, whenever you need me." She looked up at me, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Thank you, Tom. That means more than you know." Our eyes locked, and in that moment, something shifted. The air between us felt heavy, charged with unspoken emotions. I could feel my pulse quickening, and I knew that this was the moment where everything could change. But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring into her eyes as my hand remained on hers. Before I knew what was happening, Sarah leaned in and kissed me. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if testing the waters, but when I didn't pull away, it deepened, becoming more urgent, more desperate. My mind screamed at me to stop, to think about James, but my body refused to listen. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing heavily. I could see the regret and guilt flashing across her face, mirroring what I felt inside. "Sarah, we can't do this," I said, my voice shaky. "James is my best mate." "I know," she whispered, tears filling her eyes again. "But I feel so alone, Tom. I just wanted to feel something. Anything." I pulled her into a hug, trying to comfort her, but it only made things more complicated. The warmth of her body against mine, the softness of her breath on my neck, it was all too much. I knew we had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. "We should stop," I said after a long moment. "This isn't fair to James. He's your husband. We can't do this." Sarah pulled away, wiping her tears. "You're right. I'm sorry, Tom. I never meant for this to happen. I don't know what to do anymore." We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, both of us grappling with the weight of what had just happened. I knew we couldn't go back to the way things were before. Everything had changed. The next morning, Sarah left early, leaving a quiet, empty space in my home and in my heart. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The guilt weighed heavily on me, and yet I couldn't bring myself to regret it entirely. There was something between us, something that had been bubbling beneath the surface for months, and now that it had been unleashed, I wasn't sure how to handle it. Days passed, and I avoided Sarah, hoping that time and distance would make things easier. But it didn't. Every time I saw her, every time I heard her voice in passing, the memory of that kiss burned fresh in my mind. I knew we couldn't go on like this, but I didn't know how to stop it. Then, one evening, I got a text from her. "Can we talk?" I can't stop thinking about what happened. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the message, torn between what I knew was right and the desire that still lingered between us. I knew I should ignore it, should cut things off before they spiraled even further. But I couldn't. "Yeah, let's talk." I typed back. We agreed to meet at a small pub on the outskirts of town, far enough away that no one would recognize us. I arrived early, my nerves frayed as I sat at a corner table, nursing a pint of beer. When Sarah walked in, she looked just as anxious as I felt. "Tom," she said, sliding into the seat across from me, "I'm so sorry. I know I've made things complicated." "It's not just you," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "I kissed you back, Sarah. We both made a mistake." She nodded, her eyes filled with regret. I don't know how to handle everything right now. James is so far away, and I feel like I'm falling apart. And you? I don't know what I'm doing, Tom." "I know," I said softly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "But this can't happen again. We can't do this to James. We can't destroy everything." She looked down at our hands, her lips trembling. "You're right, we need to stop." We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The weight of our choices hung in the air between us, and I could feel the tension gnawing at me. I wanted to make things right, to fix what we'd broken, but I knew that some things couldn't be undone. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "I think I need to figure out what's going on with me and James," she said quietly. "I've been avoiding the truth for so long, and I don't know how to face it. But I have to. I owe him that much." I nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "Yeah, you do. James loves you, Sarah. You need to talk to him, tell him how you're feeling. Maybe he doesn't realize how much he's been neglecting you." She smiled weakly, pulling her hand away. "Maybe, but I'm scared, Tom. I don't know if things can go back to the way they were." "They might not," I admitted. "But you'll never know unless you try. You both deserve a chance to fix this." We talked for a while longer, hashing out the mess we'd made and trying to make sense of it all. By the time we left the pub, it was late, and the streets were deserted. I walked Sarah to her car, and we stood there for a moment, neither of us knowing what to say. "Thank you," she said softly, "for listening, for being here." "Any time," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "Just take Take care of yourself, okay?" She nodded, and without another word, she got into her car and drove away. As I watched her taillights disappear into the distance, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. We had made the right decision, but it didn't make it any easier. The days that followed were tough. I kept my distance from Sarah, focusing on work and trying to get back to some sense of normalcy. But the memory of that night, of the kiss, the connection we had shared, still lingered in the back of my mind. Then, about a week later, I got a call from James. "Hey, mate, I'm back in town. Thought I'd surprise you," he said, his voice cheerful as ever. "How about we grab a drink tonight? I've got so much to catch you up on." My stomach twisted into knots at the sound of his voice. I hadn't seen James in months, and now that he was back, I wasn't sure how I'd face him. The guilt I'd been carrying around was heavy, and the idea of sitting across from him, pretending everything was fine, made me feel sick. But I couldn't avoid him forever. "Yeah, sure," I said, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. "Let's meet at the Griffin. Usual spot?" "Perfect," he replied. "See you at 8. As I hung up the phone, I felt a knot of anxiety settle in my chest. How was I supposed to act normal around James after everything that had happened with Sarah? How could I look him in the eye, knowing the secret we were hiding? That evening, I arrived at the pub a little early, hoping to calm my nerves with a pint before James showed up. But as I sat there, nursing my drink, the weight of the situation bore down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to come crashing down. When James walked in, grinning from ear to ear, I plastered a smile on my face, trying to push my guilt to the back of my mind. "James, good to see you, mate," I said, standing up to give him a hug. "You too, Tom," he replied, clapping me on the back. "Man, it's been too long. Dubai was wild, but I'm glad to be home. Nothing beats a pint at the Griffin." We sat down and ordered our drinks, and for a while, everything felt normal. James regaled me with stories about his time overseas, the projects he'd been working on, and the people he'd met. I laughed along, trying to keep the conversation light, but the guilt gnawed at me the entire time. "So, how's Sarah?" I asked cautiously, trying to gauge how much he knew about what had been going on. James's face softened. "She's good, I think. We've been talking more since I got back. I know I've been away a lot, and it's been tough on her. I'm trying to make it up to her, you know? Spend more time at home, focus on us." I nodded, my throat tightening. "That sounds good, mate. I'm sure she's missed you." "Yeah," he said, taking a sip of his beer. "I've missed her too. I know I've been a bit distant, but I want to fix things. I don't want to lose her." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. How could I sit here, listening to him talk about saving his marriage, when I'd been part of the problem? The guilt was suffocating, and I knew I couldn't keep this up. But I also knew that telling James the truth would destroy him. So, I stayed silent. I let him believe that everything was fine, that his wife was waiting for him with open arms. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but I couldn't bring myself to shatter his world. Not like this. As the night wore on, I made excuses to leave, telling James I had an early meeting the next day. We said our goodbyes, and as I walked out of the pub, the weight of my actions settled heavily on my shoulders. I had lied to my best friend, and there was no going back. The next few weeks were a blur. I saw less of James, and even less of Sarah, and for a while, it seemed like things were starting to return to normal. But the guilt never fully went away. Every time I saw James, every time he talked about his plans for the future with Sarah, I felt a knot of regret twisting in my gut. Then, one evening, out of the blue, I received a text from Sarah. "I think we need to talk." My heart sank. I knew what that message meant. It wasn't over. Not for her, not for me. We met at a cafe on the other side of town, far away from where anyone would recognize us. When I arrived, Sarah was already seated at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She looked tired, her eyes hollow with the weight of everything that had happened. "Tom," she said quietly as I sat down, "I've been doing a lot of thinking and I can't keep living like this. I love James, but I can't pretend that nothing happened between us." "I know," I replied, my voice low. "I've been thinking about it too. We made a mistake, Sarah, but we can't undo it." She looked down at her coffee, her fingers trembling slightly. "I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm living a lie. I've been trying to fix things with James, but every time I look at him, I think about you. About that night. I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. Sarah, I care about you, but we have to let this go. For James's sake. For everyone's sake. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I know, but it's so hard. I don't know how to move on. We sat there in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, I stood up, the weight of our situation too heavy to bear. I think we both need some time to figure things out, to make things right with James. She nodded, her expression pained. Yeah, you're right. As I left the cafe, I felt a sense of finality settle over me. I knew that this was the end, of whatever had happened between me and Sarah, of the friendship I had once shared with James. There was no going back. The weeks that followed were difficult. I saw less and less of James, and eventually we stopped hanging out altogether. Sarah and I never spoke again, and I knew that it was for the best. But the guilt, the regret, the sense of loss, it never fully went away. In the end, I had to come to terms with the fact that some mistakes can't be undone. Some lines once crossed can't be uncrossed, and sometimes the hardest thing to do is to let go and move on. As I closed the door on that chapter of my life, I knew that I had learned a painful but important lesson. Life is full of choices, and sometimes the choices we make have consequences that ripple far beyond what we ever imagined. But in the end, all we can do is try to make amends, to learn from our mistakes, and to move forward, one step at a time.